Babysitters, what made you call the cop on the parents of the child? I didn't call the police, but I came very close. There was a little boy that I babysit for as a teenager every Friday of every other week, as no one could handle him. His grandma once showed up at a restaurant and gave him back to his parents. When she watched him point, he was always pretty good for me, mainly because I would let him marathon Bob the Builder. Anyway, one night I'm making him macaroni and cheese and he's playing in the living room. His parents had been gone a couple hours, and it had just gotten dark out. I had put the water on the stovetop and he was narrating his game for me from the living room when suddenly a door in the kitchen opened, and a man I had never seen before walked out of the basement and into the kitchen. He was dirty, scraggly hair, and freaky skinny. I immediately screamed and threw the not yet hot water at him. He started screaming and yelled that he was his uncle and he lived in the basement. He stormed back into the basement and I called the boy's parents, who told me that the man was in fact the dad's brother, who had just been released from prison and was living in the basement. They hadn't felt comfortable leaving him alone with their 3-year-old as he had been convicted of violent crimes. So they thought it would be better if I, a skinny 15-year-old girl, was there as an intermediary. I called my dad, who came and spent the next 5 hours with me until they got home. I'm not sure the conversation they had while I was waiting in the car, but I didn't babysit for them again for a long time. I called family services, if that counts. I started babysitting for a newly single mother. She had just moved into an apartment with her 3 kids, so things were understandably, at the time anyway, a total mess. Bare mattresses on the floor, clothes in piles, no food in the cupboards, the only furniture was a couch and her bed. At first I was sympathetic. I only watched her kids for her to work as a server in the evenings, and she expressed how hard she was trying to get her life together, but nothing changed at all as the weeks went by. Then she started coming in way later than when I knew the restaurant was closed, visibly messed up on drugs and alcohol. The last time I watched her daughters, she stumbled in the wee hours of the morning vomiting, completely out of her head, showing off a fresh tattoo, while earlier that same evening I had genuinely struggled to find enough food to satisfy all 3 kids. I was so sad and overwhelmed. She was paying me so well, but I realized even at 17 years old, that was called hush money. I couldn't hush. I ran into the kids in a grocery a few years later with their dad and grandma, where they told me they had been living since they saw me last. They gave me hugs and looked so happy and healthy. No one but my mom ever knew about my involvement. Edit. Whoa. My first ever awards. That's so neat. Thanks Reddit friends. Honestly thrilled. I remember struggling with the decision for a couple of days, but I've never once since started I did the read thing. I've often wondered about them over the past decade. Unfortunately their mother continued her reckless spiral and has been in and out of rehab and jail for petty theft since, so hopefully her babies were spared a few years of trauma. My mom used to babysit when I was younger. She watched these 2 boys that lived across the street from us, and it was obvious from the start that the younger was the favored brother and the older one had some developmental setbacks and was not treated as nicely. I was 8 at the time, and these boys were 4 and 5. One morning they were dropped off, and mom noticed that the older one was pretty bruised up. I mean, they were rough and tumble kids and always had a bruise or 2, but this was noticeably more than the norm. She asked him what happened, and he started to say my dad got mad and his little brother stepped in front of him and said, "No, you fell down the stairs, remember?" Older brother's eyes went wide, and he nodded and said he fell down the stairs. Mom called the deputy, who was a friend of my dad's and lived a few streets over. He came to our house and talked with my parents and promised to look into it. The boys stopped coming to our house. Mom, who grew up with an abusive father and divorced her abusive first husband, was heartbroken. My parents' house is next door to a small carry-out, and sometimes in the evenings they would send me over there to get pops and chips for a snack. A few nights after she'd talked with the sheriff was one of those times. I walked out of our house, and the father of the boys was sitting on his front stoop. Understand that this was out of the ordinary for him. They had a huge deck in the back of their house with a much better view than he was getting looking at our small town's main street. It did not occur to me until years later that he was waiting to see me on one of my very regular trips to the store. He stood up and yelled my name and waited until he knew he had my attention. Then he proceeded to tell me to go get my beach mother, to tell her that if she wanted to call the cops on him, she could come out and face him, and he'd give her something to call the cops about. It was surreal. I knew I should be scared, but I wasn't quite, just confused and honestly a little annoyed. Like, how dare he call my mom that, and he was delaying me getting chips and a pop. Like I said, I was 8. I went back in my house and told my parents. Dad stood up faster than I'd ever seen him move. Now, my dad is not a small man. He's 6 feet 2 inches tall, and at that time, was about 280 pounds of the kind of muscle a man earns honestly, by working in a steel fabrication shop, and blacksmithing in his spare time. This was also something that didn't occur to me at that age. To me, it was handy that he was tall and strong, so I could climb all over him, and he could lift me up high to see cool stuff. Mom said his name in that particular way that wives do, and even though I was only 8 I knew there were paragraphs being said with that one syllable. Dad closed his eyes and took a deep breath and called the sheriff, who came back to our house and took another statement. By this time I had begun to understand how serious and scary all this was, and was only slightly calmed a little later when Dad went next door and got me a pop and some chips. I don't know exactly what the sheriff told the neighbor, but I heard that it was less related to laws and legal consequences, and more about how large and angry my goonowning dad might be about his wife and daughter getting threatened, and how as the only officer in a 5-mile radius the deputy himself might not always have the ability to respond to calls as quickly as he'd like. The family lived there for some years after that, and when they were old enough to cross the street by themselves the boys would come over and play once in a while, until we were all 3 old enough to know that the opposite gender was gross and full of cooties, and not to be trusted. But their dad never dared to even look our direction once from that night until the day they moved to another town. I didn't call the police, but this event was pretty freaky and fortunately everyone vulnerable got out of the situation before police were needed. During my senior year of high school, my English teacher rented out his basement to a single mother and her autistic son, and he recommended me as a babysitter. It went well for a few weeks until my English teacher suddenly got weird. During one occasion, I was doing homework when a mouse ran across my foot and screamed. He rushed down into the basement to check on me, but then decided that was the time to thoroughly check every crevice of the apartment. I thought he was just checking for mice, or whatever. Cut to next week. Suddenly he was privy of stuff said that no one had told him. The mom came home one night and told me quietly she wanted to show me something, and revealed she had found a bug, like a microphone, in her stuff. I was pretty shaken up. We put her son in his car seat, and I drove her to the bank, and she broke down crying in my car about how he was spying on her. I assured her I was 100% on her side, because he had started up some inappropriate behavior with me as well, fixing me nice dinners, while he was helping me with my college essay, trying to ply me with wine, telling me his problems with his ex-wife and daughter. Then the next week, she had emailed him about something regarding a minor disagreement, and he forwarded it to me and a few of his friends. Remember, I'm 18 years old in this story, with some snarky commentary. I showed her the email immediately, to inform her that her email communications weren't private. He tried to beach me out, that I had betrayed his trust, or whatever, but one of the email recipients, another one of my teachers, agreed with my actions, and supported informing the mom of what he had done. At that point, the mom and her son moved out to live with her mother until she could find something more permanent, and I no longer went to my English teacher's house for tutoring on my essay. It was my last semester at least, so I didn't have to deal with him much longer. I don't know what his end goal was, but I'm just glad I was there for that mom and witnessed the spying, so he couldn't gaslight her in her vulnerable state. I didn't realize I had one, because it didn't seem that weird to me at the time, but I guess in hindsight it's maybe worth telling, even though it didn't cross my mind to call the police. Point: I was looking after a friend of the family's son while he was out on a date. This guy was kind of a weird secretive guy, but had known my father for years and had always treated me well. Occasionally he would show up at our house and put back a couple of wobbly pops and get even weirder and even slightly angry, but nothing really directed at us. And like I said, my folks seemed cool with him and they are generally good judges of character. So anyway, I'm at his house out in the country and he's showing me where everything is and going over rules and whatnot when he's like, oh yeah, come with me. I follow him up the stairs in his creepy old farmhouse and into his bedroom, where he walks up to his dresser and opens his top dresser drawer. He pulls out this sock stuffed with something. At this point in my life I had babysat for a bunch of different families and I've never been in any of the parents' bedrooms and never been shown some mystery object in a sock before, so I'm not sure what the hell is about to happen. So he holds the stuffed sock out towards me and starts pulling out a black object that turns out to be a freaking gun and asks me if I want to hold it. I did, so he hands me this 9mm handgun. I looked it over and asked if it's loaded and he says yep, and the whole thing got even more serious. I just said that's cool, while internally I was a bit freaked out, and handed it back to him. He put it back in the sock and back in the drawer and tells me it's time he headed out, like it was nothing. Anyway, the kid was a little shit and ended me slipping me some X-Lax, and the dad didn't come home till almost the next afternoon, but he pulled out this big wad of cash and paid me very well. So weird as it was, I just went on with my life and tried not to babysit for him again. Years later I asked my father about how this guy made his money, and my dad went on about some investments he had in various companies, and then after a bit mentioned that he also grew and sold massive amounts of marijuana to some local organizations. I didn't put it together at the time, but now I realize that the guy was giving me the means to defend myself and his son if somebody came looking for anything. Alright, so little backstory. I had a friend, we'll call him him, and I were tight, and he went out and got a girlfriend. Her name is M. We all three hang a couple times. She had 4 kids, but only custody of 1. Couple weeks go by, she asks if I would mind babysitting. I said sure, no problem. Start sitting 2 times a week. That goes on for about 2 months and bam, she lost her house. So, being the naive 19-year-old I was, rented a house for them in my name. Put the deposit down, turn on utilities, borrow money from my boss at the time to do it. They move in. Life continues pretty well for another couple months. One day I get a call from S saying M dropped off the baby and went to work, and he needed to stay late, so could I come get the baby? Okay. I go get him. I called M later to ask about pickup. She asks if I can keep him overnight. I say okay, no problem. Baby is asleep anyways. I didn't hear from M or S for 5.5 months. I kept baby, had to hire another babysitter so I could work, and was desperate to find M. Finally, she calls one night 2 AM. M tells me she lost track of time and wanted to come get baby, she missed him. I said hell no, you disappeared for 6 months bro. She finally said she would call the police for kidnapping if I didn't bring baby back. Now, I'm 19 and had no real life experience yet, so I cave. Take baby to the house on a Friday, bring diaper bag and such, and tell her I will be back Sunday to check on them. She says okay, no problem. They were just gonna hang there for the weekend. I come back Sunday, gut feeling, early afternoon. I walk up to the house and the door is open a little. Walk in and everything was super quiet. Hello. I hear baby in the kitchen. Walk around the corner, and he is sitting on the floor eating a block of cheese, fridge wide open, absolutely covered in literal sheet, wearing the same clothes, diaper, and socks I dropped him off in. I rush to pick him up and head to the sink. I'm yelling for M&S, but don't hear anything. Get him cleaned and make a bottle for him, clean up the kitchen floor where he had smeared sheet from crawling around, and went to look for M&S locked bedroom door. I broke in with a butter knife to find both of them passed out on the bed. M has a needle in her arm still. Got the baby, left the house, called the cops, and didn't see either of them until court 2 months later. She screamed at me in the middle of court saying I took everything from her. S wouldn't say anything. I stayed with baby at DHS until grandparents from out of state got there. Turns out M had taken baby and disappeared without birth father's knowledge, and baby actually had an Amber Alert from out of state. Birth father got there within 2 hours of grandparents and cried into my chest and thanked me over and over for finding his baby and taking care of him for so long. I still get yearly updates from birth father and grandparents with school pictures and stuff. So glad I was around to help that sweet boy. Me and my best friend, both 14-year-old females, were to babysit together for a new young couple in the neighborhood. We arrived at their house and they seemed nice and friendly. They gave us all the instructions and told us they would just be down the street, but would be out quite late. 1 AM rolls around. We had both of the kids we were watching in bed upstairs, and we were both dozing on the couches in the living room. At this point the father came home, saw us dozing on the couches, screamed bloody murder at us, threw a few things, and then left while screaming that he was going to get his wife and they were going to kill both of us for endangering their house and kids. It was obvious that he was drunk, smelled of booze, and possibly coked out. My friend freaked out, so I sent her upstairs to guard the kids. I called my friend's dad because he was only 5 houses away from us. I told him what happened. He said lock the door and he would call the cops and be over right away. I locked the door, grabbed a huge kitchen knife, and stood guard. Her dad showed up just as the parents arrived. The wife attacked my friend's dad while the husband kicked in the door of his house. The cops arrived just as he smashed the door off its hinges. Small town, local RCMP attachment only 20 blocks away. 3 cars arrived with 5 cops. The cops took down all 3 adults, but sorted out pretty quickly who was a problem. The one cop walked in on me, commented on the knife I was holding, and asked if I and if everyone else in the house was okay. The parents were arrested. I assume child services was called for the kids. My friend went home with her dad, and I was driven home by the cops. My dad came to the door when I got home, and the police talked to him because they wanted him to know what happened and that I wasn't hurt or in trouble. My mom, being the nut job she was slashes, decided that the situation was still my fault and grounded me. Oh man. One of the scariest moments of my life. I was in my early 20s and was a regular nanny for a family with 2 kids who sometimes had play dates with other kids, and on occasion I would pick up a shift or 2 for those families if I had free time. Mom was out of town for a conference and dad worked 9 to 5, so I picked up these kids from school on a Friday and walked home with them. Expected to do the usual, snack, homework, some light dinner prep until dad got home, except dad was home when we got there. He was pacing around in the kitchen and acting really strange. The first thing that tipped me off was he hadn't driven home. He must have walked because his car wasn't there. The kids were old enough to tell something was off, and I didn't know this family that well, so I was really on edge. I asked the kids to stay in the living room by the entryway and slowly approached dad. This is in the US, and he was from the UK. He told me that he was feeling a bit queer and asked if I could take him to the hospital, all the while pacing around the kitchen non-stop. I told him I don't have a car, but that I could call an ambulance, and he said no ambulance, no cops. That was when I started to make a conscious effort to make sure I was in between him and the way into the living room. I said I would call the mom of the family I was a regular nanny for to see if she could take him because they lived nearby. She didn't answer, so I texted her to tell her what was going on. She called me as soon as she got the text and said I'm calling the cops, I'll be over soon. Apparently this guy had a history of doing stuff like this, and the moms were close so she knew. My one goal was to get the kids out as soon as possible. I saw her pull up, and I said okay let's go outside now. I stayed between him and the kids as we walked outside of the house and got the kids into her car, which she had left running. She got out, and I got in the driver's seat and drove away right as the cops pulled up, guns blazing, screaming at him to get down on the ground. They arrested him, and I guess he had some kind of medical crisis, because they ended up taking him to the hospital, where they discovered he had some kind of tumor on his pituitary that sucked some vital nutrient out of his body and made him act insane. Please forgive me, I don't know the exact medical details. I called the kid's mom to tell her what was going on, and she apologized profusely and said she was heading back from her conference immediately, but it was a 5-hour drive. I fed the kids, put put them to bed and crashed on the couch until mom got home around 2 a.m. He did have some underlying mental illness that he had to deal with post-tumor removal, but he is okay now as far as I know, though he did move back to the UK. Kids and mom are good. I still see them around. Really earned my pay that day. I always watched this one family that had 3 kids, 11, 6, and 4. Anyway, one time I watched them and they were super excited because their dad was coming home. Military family. So we made signs and cookies to welcome him. I noticed the 11-year-old was quieter than usual, but his mother said he had started puberty and was a bit moody, so I let it go. Anyway, the next time I came was 2 days later because the parents wanted date night. The mom said that the 11-year-old was in his room and wouldn't come out, and if I wanted to I could try to get him to come out, but she was fine with him needing alone time. I went upstairs after a while to bring him a sandwich and I saw him leaving the bathroom. He had massive bruises on his cheek and on his arm. As soon as he saw me, he ran to his room, but I caught the door before he could close it. I questioned him very gently about the bruises, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer, just half mumbled excuses. I immediately knew what was going on because I myself had been abused as a kid. When the parents came home I told them what I saw, but they just laughed it off. I then said that I know what abuse looks like, and maybe they didn't know this was considered abuse. The father got really defensive and even raised his hand to slap me, yelling about stupid beaches and them being his kids, and what do I know. So I called the police, and after an investigation, it turned out that he was suffering from PTSD and hitting the 11-year-old as a coping mechanism. The mother refused to believe it and kept calling the kid and me liars. Eventually, the kids were sent to family while the father went through therapy. As far as I know, the kids are all safe and happy now, thank God, and the father got through his PTSD and is now a stable man who runs a garage. I'm not a babysitter, but I got a story. For context, at the time I was 6 to 7, male, babysitter was about 14, female, and her sister was about 16 to 17. My babysitter, we'll call her Linda, had a habit of showing me her mom's porno tapes when at her house. Mom and dad lived separately. She mostly lived at her mom's with her sister, saw her dad every now and then who lived on the other side of town. And whenever we went over to her dad's, she would always show me his skin mags, and her sister still do. She'd always ask me how I felt after watching all this adult entertainment. And I remember just kinda shrugging it off most of the time. One night we were at her mom's. I had to stay the night since my mom was working a third shift that night. I woke up with her on top of me and to my knowledge had me inside her. I didn't know what was going on, so I started crying. She out her hand over my mouth, which just made me panic more. What Linda failed to realize was that between both of us falling asleep and her doing this was that her sister came home. And thank God she did. Her sister came out of her room, saw the situation, kicked Linda in the face, picked me up, and put me in her bedroom, and locked the door. I remember hearing screaming, slapping, and things breaking. At one point, there was about a minute of silence before the sister came back into the room and held me. Few minutes after that, I heard a very commanding voice say, "Sheriff's Department, if there's anybody inside, make yourself known." To which the sister replied back, "Bedroom, he's with me and he's safe." One of the officers scooped me up and carried me outside where my mother was waiting, since she had gotten a call about this while at work. He put me in her arms and brought me home where her boyfriend was waiting to watch me as she went back to talk to the officer. To wrap it up, Linda had fled the scene. Linda's mom had come home shortly after my mom dropped me back off at our house. My mom didn't want to press charges because she knew what was waiting for Linda when she came back home. A Rasta Prime, grade A, old-fashioned Azupin, which she got a couple times, and I never heard from or saw her again. Until a couple years ago. I am 26 now. I ran into Linda on my 23rd birthday when I was at a friend's. She pulled me outside and bawled begging me to forgive her, and I did. She's now married with 3 kids and is working a $50,000 a year job and is very successful in her job. I was glad to see her doing so well. This thread is pretty dark, so I'll tell my story because it's lighter, even though it only barely fits. I only babysat twice in my life, both for the same family. It was in 1993, during the World Series. I was only 9, too young, but apparently finding a babysitter for World Series game nights in Toronto was no easy task, so I got hired. I was a huge Jays fan, but the game started after the kids went to bed, and they had better TV and snacks than my house, so it was all good. The babysitting was mostly uneventful. Kids were spoiled jerks, but I gave them sugar until they passed out. It was game 4, which Torontonians know is the crazy 15 to 14 game that lasted 4+ hours. The parents were assholes who said they'd be home by 9 when they were at a watch party that would obviously go much later. I figure as much, so I'm slightly nervous as the game ends, but not really. 30 minutes goes by, an hour, more nervous. Here's where I was stupid. In my house, calling after my dad went to bed was bad news. So 2 hours after the game is over, but I won't call. I'm 9 and don't want to get yelled at. It's worth pointing out that I live 3 houses away, so there was no real danger. So around 3 AM, and I wake up from a nap, and I'm kind of freaking out. I can't call home, don't want the kids to wake up. So I call the non-emergency police line. Thankfully, they listened to my story, explained that the parents may be stuck in traffic, and told me to call my parents. My 17-year-old sister came over and saved me. She sent me home to bed. As I was walking home, I saw a cab pull up to their house and the very drunk parents stumble home. Even though I've been both a babysitter and worked at a daycare, my most memorable story happened when I was being babysat. I don't know how old I was at the time. It's one of those blurry around the edges memories that I'm not sure are mine, or a memory I created after my parents told me about it. I think I was 4, so my long-time babysitter was over. It was the middle of the afternoon. I asked for tater tots, and she puts some in the oven for both of us. When she goes to open the oven door to take them out, the oven explodes. This is the only part that I have a vivid memory of. She's pushed backwards and lands across the room. Nothing is on fire, but it's now really hot. The tater tots are burning up and causing a lot of smoke, and my babysitter is on the floor unconscious. Being the resourceful girl I was, I walked myself over to the neighbor's house, a very kind, old man artist that had 2 little Yorkies and would babysit me as well sometimes. Let myself into his back garden, knocked on his door, and told him that the babysitter burned the tater tots and was taking a nap. Confused, he walked me back over to the house and upon re-entry, immediately picked up the babysitter, brought her and me back over to his house, and called 911. While we waited for the cops, he went back in and made sure all of my dogs and cats were safe. He even went as far to make sure the dogs were in their pen so they wouldn't run away. At the time, he had to have been around 70 years old. Babysitter was totally fine, just a small concussion and a few burns. Can't remember the reason for the stove blowing up, but there were burn marks up the wall in the kitchen for a year. Babysitter took a few months to start babysitting me again, but she continued for a while after that. My old neighbor still sends me postcards and I have lovingly called him Grandpa for as long as I can remember it. According to my mom, old stove. You had to light it with a match, but you had to do it with the door open. Otherwise the gas built up inside the oven and would explode when lit, which caused the oven door to fly open and the hot gas to blow you across the room. Apparently she did this to herself a couple of times too. I was a camp counselor a few years ago and had the cops called on me. I was working as a camp counselor at a summer camp where we would take up to 8 kids, 4 to 12, on the city bus to various locations around the city. This involved a lot of walking in the 100+ summer heat. The location we would take the kids to were normally free, so museums, hikes, parks, playground, splash pads, libraries, movie theater once a week, etc. We worked 4 days of about 10 hours a week. I was the full-time substitute counselor who would rotate to the 4 different locations for that counselor's day off. There were new kids each week, but for me, that meant new kids each day. Some kids signed up for more than 1 week, which helped a little with bonding. We also oftentimes met up with at least one other group, if not all the other groups. Meeting up with the other groups meant that you were with at least one other adult, which helped when you had to go to the bathroom or if you were dealing with a difficult child. This one day I had a very stressful group and was not meeting up with the other groups at all. If I remember correctly, it was me with a 4-year-old boy who was absolutely insane. He shouldn't have been in this sort of summer camp. He was a runner and listened terribly. Walking on city streets with him was terrifying. He didn't listen to his mom well when she dropped him off either. Also, my position, I was the travel in camp counselor, so other than seeing me at other locations that week, I was a stranger to him. There were also 4 boys around 10 years old. They could care less about helping with the crazy kid. None of these boys were in camp in previous weeks. There was also a sweet 5-year-old girl. She went to camp every week. Again, can't help much because she was 5. Our schedule this day was to take the bus to a small art museum. This museum was tiny and in a historic house. There was a man there giving us a tour. The art museum was also full of sculptures. Marble busts on tables. There were sculptures everywhere. They were delicate and I was terrified. We talked about behaviors and expectations before we went into the museum. Once we went into the museum, crazy kid went crazy. The tour guide had a terrified look on his face. Crazy kid wouldn't let me hold his hand. He started running around the museum and even under a red rope that was obviously there to not cross. I was terrified. The rest of the group was listening well and close by, so I went to handle crazy kid. He couldn't be talked into sanity, so I told the other kids that I was very sorry, but we had to go. They were very disappointed. If we had gone with another group, then the rest of the kids could have continued the tour, while any kids acting a fool would sit outside and not participate. This wasn't the case. Luckily, nothing was broken. Also note, the only other person in the museum was the terrified tour guide. After talking outside the museum, we walked in a single file line to a park that was 2 blocks away and noticed a car slowing driving by us. This was a nice neighborhood, but I found it very strange. They slowed down for a bit even. The kids were all well behaved at this point, walking in a straight line on the sidewalk. I was at the end so that I could view all the kids. I believe I was holding crazy kid's hand. I believe he let me. We get to the park, sit at the picnic table and eat lunch. I'm in a pretty troubled mood at this point because there isn't even a moment to go to the bathroom because I didn't trust the other kids to watch crazy kid. I hide it fairly well. After eating, the kids go to play on the playground and all is good. I have my eyes on the kids 100% of the time. Crazy kid is kind of getting the sweet girl to play meaner than normal, but all else is great. There are 2 trees between the picnic table I'm at and the swings that 2 of the boys are at. Even with the trees, I can see them perfectly. At some point, a cop walks out of his car and comes to talk to me. He said they got a call that said I wasn't watching the kids. We wear all the same shirts, so I'm sure that's how they found us. I tell the cops what happened. He says he believes me and leaves. I have absolutely no clue what I was doing to cause someone to call the cops. The only time anything was crazy, we were in museum with one person. I had us leave when I realized that we needed to. When the one car drove past us slowly, we were walking closely together where I had a clear view of the kids. I wasn't on my phone. I had to call my boss and tell her what happened because I obviously didn't want her to find out another way. We had the name of our club on our t-shirts. I called her at the bus stop and had the kids sit in the grass so that it still looked professional that I was on my phone. She was relatively nice about the incident. She said I should have called if I was overwhelmed, makes sense, and to be aware of my surroundings at all times because people get too noisy sometimes. Since it was a private club, I couldn't really let the parent know how awful their child was. Not a babysitter, but my elementary school called CPS on my parents. I was 8 when I started my period. I had gone to the bathroom and noticed that I had blood on my underwear, and I started to cry. It scared me. I hadn't been to the maturation program yet, nor had anyone given me any sort of talk, so I wasn't sure what was wrong with me. When I went to the office, they asked me what was wrong, and I said I was bleeding from my privates. Office ladies' faces dropped and went kind of grim. The school cop and social worker came to the school nurse office and asked me questions which I now understand were because they suspected I was being abused at home. Since 8 is awfully young to be getting your period. My mom was called and she told the police and social worker that I had been starting to mature for a while now and I had already been taken to a doctor. They didn't believe her. I was taken away and stayed at some sort of residential facility until I was given an examination a few days later to confirm whether or not I was being abused. The examiner found I was already growing pubic hair and nothing to indicate abuse, and went on to confirm with the pediatrician that I saw regularly did in fact have documented information in my medical records that I was showing signs of maturity in my last few examinations. I often wonder if this incident just set the tone for my reproductive system or something, because I've had nothing but issues with it as an adult. Oh. Finally something for me to comment on. I've been babysitting since I was a kid myself, but also have been a full-time nanny for 5 years. The very first family I ever worked for got weirder and weirder as months passed working for them. When I started with them, they both left the house to work their full-time jobs. As months passed, the mom began staying home because she was sick. Unfortunately, it became exceedingly clear that she was extremely depressed. The mom was so kind, if not a little odd, but I felt so bad for her because her husband was literally the creepiest and most bizarre man I have ever met. So the mom continues to stay home from work and eventually gets fired. The problem is, they lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment with 2 children. So mom stayed home to job hunt and I nannied for their daughters. Then the dad starts working from home, leaving me to sit inside with the 2 girls, their mom and their dad in the same damn room for 9 hours a day. I eventually told them I wasn't cool with them both working from home as they were extremely loud and the father's home etiquette became creepier and creepier. He started having me wake him up the morning when I came in for the day, always asleep shirtless. Then he worked in the living room with only boxers and a robe on. He also used to insist on hugging and kissing his daughters while I was holding them. He also insisted on watching me bathe his youngest daughter. Lots of borderline harassment moments, but what brought me to consider calling CPS on them was the way the dad would kiss his oldest daughter. He would kiss her arm, slowing from her hand all the way up to her shoulder, and it felt inappropriate for me as she was nearly 6. I had an affectionate family, but kissing up an arm felt extremely romantic, not fatherly. He also out of nowhere would say things like I don't bathe with the girls anymore because it wouldn't be appropriate. Completely out of context. I also learned that his last nanny came across a journal he had left open in the kitchen that comprised of notes he took in order to get over his porn addiction. TLDR, nannied for a family in a tiny house. Mom was depressed and dad was either creepy or totally unconnected with how to operate around other people. Almost called CPS on him kissing up his daughter's arm. So this isn't quite what you asked, but I used to be a counselor at a state-funded camp for underprivileged kids. It was extremely poorly run and the owners were awful greedy people. We worked hard to give those kids as good of a summer as we could, knowing many of them had hard lives outside of camp. There were often issues, but here's one I'll never forget. There were these 2 kids, brother and sister. For privacy's sake, I'll call them Ann and John. Ann was 4 years old. Technically she too young to come to camp, but she was given special permission. She was the sweetest girl in the world. She would call us, me and the other bus monitor, Carly, who I was close friends with, her pizza buddies, no idea why, and always wanted to hug everyone. John was 7, and he was so protective of Ann. They always sat together, even when they fought they were still always together. Every time John saw Ann throughout the day at camp, he took the time to stop and talk to her and hug her. He was such a good big brother, even though he was so little. Sometimes, we were given explicit instructions on who the kids were to be picked up by. Whether it was because of an ongoing custody battle or some other issue, it would happen that one of the kids could only ever be released to one person. John and Ann were only ever to be picked up by one of their grandparents, who they lived with. There was never to be any exception. At one point, Ann had started becoming friends with some other girls on the bus and wanted to sit with them. I'd sit with John on those days, so he wouldn't be lonely. The other monitor would sit near Ann, just to make sure everything was going okay. One day, I was sitting with John when Carly came and grabbed my shoulder. She said there was an issue with Ann, and we needed to talk immediately. We went to the back of the bus, away from the kids. Carly told me that one of Anne's friends said she was talking about inappropriate things and didn't want to sit with her anymore. I was sad for Anne, but if they needed to be separated, we could put her and John together again. But Carly told me that wasn't the issue. Anne had told the girl that her parents used to have sex with her and with John, and that's why they couldn't live together anymore. We tried to be as careful as we could to separate the kids without Anne thinking she was in trouble. We were terrified that Anne would close up and not talk to us. I stayed with John while Carly took her to the back of the bus, where Anne repeated what she'd said. When we got to camp, we notified the owners, and each of us wrote out a full report with as much detail as possible. Their grandparents came to the camp and picked them up early, but they were back the next day. They never missed a day of camp. About a week later, while we were dropping Anne and John off, their grandmother asked me and Carly to step off the bus so she could talk to us. She had copies of our reports in an envelope. She confirmed to us that John and Anne had been taken away from their parents and that molestation was highly suspected, but they could never prove it. Their grandmother told us both Anne and John had been in therapy, but they would never talk about it. She said, "I don't know what you two did, but they never felt safe enough to talk about what happened to them." And she said that with our reports, they had their first piece of solid evidence against the parents. She hugged us and thanked us, then took John and Anne off the bus and into the house. I cried so much for those kids, but I was so glad they were safe with their grandparents. Somewhere, I still have the drawings that Anne and John made me on our last day of camp. I think about them a lot. I wasn't directly involved in this. However, here goes an infamous story about how the founder of nanny service in my town turned out to be way more interested in kids than he should be. There is this establishment in my town where you would put your kids after school to do sports and art and whatever. Main point being keep them entertained after school before you pick them up after work. It was usual for this place to hire teams to take care of younger kids, with exception of a few adults that made sure the place ran efficiently. I used to go there too as a kid, and I remember the man of this story to be very kind, always remembered everyone's name, etc. A really harmless cool guy. Fast forward several years, I'm in HS, and like 3 of my classmates now work at that place taking care of kids, and rumors started bubbling up between them how the man is really into little boys, doing and saying inappropriate things. Apparently, he was befriending younger boys that were attending the place as well as older teen boys who have been working there, trying to lure them out during weekends and such to spend time with him at his home. One day the man gets arrested because he was talking to young boys, 8, 10 about erections, ejaculation, and such while they were changing in locker rooms of said establishment. One of the boys brought it up at home. His parents called police and CPS on the establishment, and the man was arrested. After further investigation, it was revealed that once he successfully lured one of the boys to his home, he asked him to participate in sexual acts with him in exchange for expensive electronics such as iPhones. There were 10 confirmed victims in total, who at the time of assault were over the age of 15, which is age of consent in my country, so it wasn't considered a rap or anything. But the rumor says that there were many more young men over the age of 18 used by him. The report doesn't mention them because they were legal adults and didn't come forward about this. The man sat a few days in jail during the investigation, so he wouldn't influence the victims to change their statements about the matter, and then he was let go with a lifetime ban to work with children. He then changed his name and moved far away. Now here comes a very faked up thing. Remember how few of my classmates worked there? They opened up about this one time at school. They said that everyone knew about this. We all knew this was happening, but no one ever said a damn word to the police. Also, when asked if all these things happening was true, one of the male classmates said, "Oh yeah, look at this." Then he pulled out his new iPhone 7 or whatever was new at the time and added, "How do you think I got it?" The whole incident was very disturbing. Not a babysitter, but was an English tutor for 1st 3rd grader. This particular student was passed to me from my tutor friend because he was troublesome, difficult to pay attention, tantrums and whatnot. Point on my second time teaching him, I noticed bruises on the upper tricep area of his hand. Little guy was wearing tank top, so I asked him did he fell or SMTH. Point as it turns out, this kid was constantly beaten. If he get bad grades, Asian standard means A equals OKAY, B equals BEATING. And he was repressing emotional rage and depression, getting bullied at school, and loneliness. His parents both work full-time. Only a nanny was present, and even then the nanny dare not speak out due to fear of being fired. Third time I see it, I asked what happened, and he said he got into a fight with the school bully, so parents got called to school, and you guessed it, more beatings at home. Fourth time was the worst. Kids got bruises on his face. Turns out he got punched by his dad because he couldn't submit his homework sheet. The bully kid tore it, and he carried home that torn paper all muddy and crumpled. He was too afraid to tell his teacher about it, and OFC the teacher phoned the parents about how their kid didn't submit his homework sheet, which eventually ends up with him getting punched. That was my last straw. Decided to call CPS, and here, they took the kid, took the nanny, and my testimony of the physical abuse. Point kid was adopted by a different parent, and I still teach him English until he was grade 6, and afterwards he would just invite me for games. Kid really liked Oblivion and MGS and ice cream every Wednesday. Point kid drove up to my house to show off his driving license a couple days ago, and he brought ice cream for me and my wife. Point Michael, I'm happy for you, man. One time I spent the night at the family's house I was babysitting. I was more of a nanny at that point, over all the time with or without mom or dad being home, help cook, that sort of thing. They lived in a guard-gated community with security. I slept downstairs in one of the guest rooms. The baby, 2 at the time, was asleep in his room at the top of the stairs, and mom was asleep in her room on the opposite side of the house, in that back. I was nervous to sleep over. I never slept anywhere else as a child or teenager, especially not without family. Around 2 AM there is pounding on the front door. And I mean pounding. I call my now husband and tell him what's going on and explain how nervous I am. I texted the mom and called her multiple times. Then I hear the front door open but never close. And it was a big as door, probably like 12 feet tall and twice the size of a regular front door. I hide in the closet because I'm terrified at this point and all I think about is the baby. I keep calling and texting the mom, but I get no response. My husband told me to call the cop. They finally get there, and the mom comes out of her room pissed. Who is in my house? What's going on? And I explain the situation. It was the security guard that was pounding on the door because she left the garage open. Believe it or not, I ended up getting in trouble because I was scared for our safety. Oh, and because I didn't answer the door, and she had to come downstairs all drugged out on sleeping pills. I had to call the police because the parents didn't come back. My dad was a gas station manager, and one day, while I was hanging out with him at work, a regular customer asked if I ever did any babysitting. I looked at my dad, and he nodded a bit, so I said sure. He told me that guy had been coming to his gas station for years and he knew him and his wife decently well, and he thought it should be fine. Well, the plan was they were going to pick me up from my dad's gas station and bring me to their place, go out for a while, then when they got back they would bring me back to him at the gas station. So they come get me and everything seems okay. The kids are a little bratty, fighting in the back seat, but no big deal. Their house turned out to be a rundown trailer in a small trailer park in the Botanies. I grew up poor, so it's not anything I wasn't used to, but it surprised me, since their car was really nice. Turned out they didn't have a phone either, and this was right before cell phones were a really thing. So the 3 hours I was supposed to be there goes by, then 4, then 5, then 6. At this point it's past 10, and I'm freaking out. I decided to leave the kids in a playpen and try and see if any neighbors will let me use their phone. After several door knocks I finally find one and call my dad. I'm in tears at this point, but I give him the address and he comes to sit with me at the trailer. Another hour goes by and we call the police. The parents still didn't come back during the whole interview process and the kids were taken by DCS. My dad is thinking something terrible has happened to them, as surely they wouldn't just abandon their kids with the 15-year-old babysitter, right? Well, they finally came home the next day, over 30 hours after they had dropped me off at their house, and it turned out they had went and done a bunch of heroin and were too messed up to keep up with time. Turns out my dad didn't know the guy that well after all. Not exactly the same type of deal, but I was doing some volunteer work and got connected to tutor this boy who was 14 when we met. I'd drive to the charity group house where he was living with his siblings and mother once or twice a week to help him work through some online math lessons to get him caught up for the upcoming school year. They hadn't lived in this city long and had fallen on hard times, so they were staying in this house run by a charity that tries to keep families together and off the street and helps get the parents set up with new jobs and such. Well, like 3 to 4 weeks into my time there, they get thrown out and moved to some other women's shelter that's a much less nice place. I wasn't allowed to know where, presumably because it was for battered women and their kids escaping domestic violence and needed to be kept super secret, but he got my number and I started just picking him up at a library that was nearby to hang out with me for the day and just get out of that place. Kid didn't have a phone or internet connection in that shelter with all those other dysfunctional people, and I felt so bad for him. He was a 15-year-old boy at that point, no peers. This was last summer, and I was 26 at the time. Kinda cool older brother / young adult man figure for this kid. I have a good job and work from home, and have my own kinda cool car, etc. Hope to make an impression on him, and show him that school is important, and that he could work hard and get stuff. Anyway, he would ride around with me, and help me with yard work, and help my girlfriend and I move to our new house, and I would pay him for his time. Not a legit summer job, but he couldn't get one without a phone number or an address anyway, and public transit is basically not a thing in this city, so it would be nearly impossible for him to get to work anyway. Showed him how to paint a bit, and had him help us paint the interior of the house before we moved in. Showed him some other stuff like how to use a sawzall and proper safety stuff with power tools and that sort of thing. We had a pretty good summer for the most part, and I think he learned a lot in that time. Showed him how I use a weed water and some simple lawnmower operation stuff. Helped him get his own new phone set up in his name, and got him set up with a data plan that he could pay as he went as payment for the work he'd been helping me do. Things were good, and he had podcasts, and could contact me easily. Then one day he calls me, and is freaking out, because I guess something happened at the shelter and cops took his mom away, leaving him and his 11 or 12-year-old sister, who had only met like once, in passing, in the hands of the non-profit case workers, not even actual government employees, because there's no funding for that sheet here. Basically they had nowhere to go, and his Hail Mary play was to see if I could ride a bus with them as an adult supervisor to get them to their grandparents' house where they had family. They had to leave the shelter that night, or else they'd be put into a foster care group home and very likely end up getting split up. So we talked back and forth with the caseworker, and eventually they called the other charity or guide worked with and stuff, and decided it was worth the risk. I told them I'd just rent a car and drive them, because I couldn't take the time off work it would require to ride a bus. I'd have flown with them and paid my ticket out of pocket for the same reason, but they didn't have any legit current ID with which to get on a plane, so they stayed at my place that night, and we Ubered to a hotel the next morning to pick up a rental car. I drove them 10.5 hours to their grandparents' house like 3 states away. I never found out what the mother did to get the cops called, but I suspect it was either some kind of threat of self-harm or maybe threat of violence against the kids. She was apparently being required to be kept for observation for a period, and would be free to be released if she cooperated. I still think about him and his sister. It's been about a year. I really hope he's doing well. His grandparents and uncles were lovely people, but I only got to talk to them for about 5 minutes before I had to get back in the car and head back. He gave me a hug when we parted. Cops weren't called, but they almost were by me. The mom had me watch her 2 kids and her boyfriend's 3. She had tied her youngest child's door closed to the stair railing with a heavy-duty leash. I thought this was a horrible idea, but she insisted I leave it alone or the kid would destroy the kitchen if I fell asleep, which I rarely did, so I called her youngest child's dad and asked him what I'd do. He was pissed. Told me cut the leash and he would take care of it. So I did, and then a little while later I get a phone call from the mom still. She tells me to get out of the house, that X had contacted the mom and flipped sheet over the leash thing, and she was on her way home to beat the sheet out of me. Sil was on her way as she talked to me. Sil gets there a few minimums before the mom does, and mom goes straight for me yelling she's gonna kill me. Sil screams Chess, run. And I duck out the door. Sil throws one punch and knocks mom out cold in her drunken stupor. I'm running through the woods, in the dark trying to find my way out, and it's been like 15 minutes or so, and I finally find the road and curl up on my heels against a tree, to try to figure out what the fuck just happened. I see headlights, and I panic, until I hear Sil calling for me. She picks me up, and takes me home, and tells me what happened. I was fired for telling her ex, and she threatened to have the cops called on me. Ex still let me babysit, when he had the kids. Sil still let me babysit, and the mom's daughter has been calling me her real mom since that day almost 13 years ago now. A while back I used to work at a daycare and agreed to babysit a set of 3-year-old twins in my class. Their mother was nice, but she was a single mother who had lost custody of her oldest son some years prior, but had a close relationship with him and her parents, his legal guardian, who lived nearby. She worked for a refinery, but was always glammed up outside of work, heels, spot on makeup, dresses, and she was easily over 6 feet tall, and had just gotten a boob job. I'm just painting a picture of what she looks like for reasons. So she told me she was going on a date with a guy she met on Craigslist, and should be back around 1 am. It pushes 1 am. No phone call, no nothing. I text her and let her know the kids went down without a fuss and ask if everything's okay. Nothing. 3 am rolls around. I call her. It rings and rings. I leave a voicemail. I wake up on the couch around 7 am and realize she still isn't home. Now I'm thinking the worst, she's dead in some guy's trunk or something. I wake the kids up and ask if they know the number for their grandparents or have emergency numbers written down anywhere. They don't. I take them with me to the neighbor's house and the neighbor has the grandparents' number. I call them and explain the situation. They seem very unsurprised and say they'll try and reach her pushing 10/11 am. I'm sitting outside on the phone with the police, called the non-emergency number. When the mom and some dude pull up, he never gets out of the car and just stares at me through the window. Mom gets out of the car wearing a large, oversized men's jersey, swinging her heels from her fingertips, and she's laughing. Call the police. She laugh. Oh my gosh. I can't believe you were so worried. I can't believe she doesn't realize how worried I was and how angry I'm now. I wait until Sleazy Joe drives off, and I hang up with the officer and tell her how worried I was and ask why didn't she answer her phone, to which she simply replies, I fell asleep. I never babysit for her again. But yeah, I eventually called the police. Not a babysitter, but I did have to call CPS a couple times. My mom's house is next to halfway house, temporary lodgings for families who'd otherwise be homeless, run by the Salvation Army. One time I was walking home from a friend's house and saw one of the kids from that house sitting on the gutter, covered in scratches and bruises. Out of the blue he asked if he could stay a night at our place. We'd never talked before. I said he could come over but not stay the night. I got him to tell me what happened. His mom's guard dog mauled him, and when he hit the dog with a metal pipe to get it away from him, his mother beat him. I called my mom, and she told me to call the cops, who in turn contacted CPS. I was 15 at the time. The second time it was about 2 am, and I was woken up by shouting next door. This was about 1 to 2 years later. I peeked out the window, and this was in the dead of winter, like -4 degrees Celsius. Thankfully it doesn't show here, but it was freezing cold and raining. And there was a crying toddler in only nappies outside the house, and I heard the mother scream, you can come back in when you stop faking crying. Naturally I called the cops. That beach was hauled away that night and the kids taken into protective custody. I had to testify in court to what I'd seen. I swear some people just don't deserve to have kids. For backstory, my family and extended family are all immigrants and all my aunts and uncles were always working, like double shifts and shit, so I babysit a ton, even when I really didn't want to. I was raised in America since really young, so I don't understand Filipino culture as much anymore, but family is super important for Filipinos. So, no matter what, family came first. Another thing I didn't understand about Filipino culture was how parents hit their children with belts and flip-flops. I went with it most of the time, and I got hit myself during numerous occasions. Cause it's just a nation thing, so I always let it slide. Whenever my aunts and uncles wanted to use a little bit of corporal punishment, the one time I couldn't let it slide was when my cousin, she was like 9 at the time, and I was like 19, accidentally knocked a whole cabinet down. It was one of those glass slide cabinets, and my aunt, put all these glass knickknacks in it that she collects. My cousins, all 3 of them were Aunt C's children, were playing around, and A wasn't watching where she was going, and ran straight into the thing. She wouldn't have been able to push it back, and I managed to pull her out of the way in time. I'm super sure that, if I didn't, she would have gotten glass all over her. We managed to push the cabinet back upright, since everything in it was on the floor, so it was light now. The slide doors of the thing were absolutely busted, and there was glass everywhere. I told the kids to go into their room so that I could clean up as much glass as possible. When my Aunt C came home, she got so mad I couldn't clean all of the glass up in time. She literally grabbed A by the arm and pushed her into the glass. She got shards of it in her palms and on her knees. She was absolutely bawling, and it looked like my aunt wanted to shove her face down into the glass on the floor. I called the cops so fast. I was so scared of my Aunt C, she was so furious, and I seriously feared for the life of my cousin. She got arrested, and my cousins live with another aunt now cause they deemed my uncle, Aunt C's husband, also incapable of taking care of my cousins. Most of my family is still angry at me about doing it. They always tell me that I should have minded my own business and let Aunt C raise her kids however she wanted. I don't regret interfering. So I was a live-in nanny for a military household. They had 2 boys, 2 and 12 weeks, beautiful boys. They also had a plethora of exotic pets, a dog and cat, but also 2 huge adult boas. The woman was nuts, up and down, nice one minute not the next, used to accuse me of stealing, would refuse to give me time off. It was always inconvenient. Anyway, there had been a couple of issues, but her behavior was escalating. She was up and down, emotional and angry. She asked me to feed the animals one day. I told her I would, but I was scared of the boas. She used to tease and say things like, well, if you don't feed them, they'll escape and kill the cat. A couple of weeks later, the cat goes missing. I ask what happens. She says, one of the snakes got out and laughed demonically. A few weeks later, she comes into my room when I'm getting ready for work and says the snakes are out panicking. She says take the boys out, so I do. I come home an hour or so later and ask if they're caught/away. She says no, just don't put the kids to bed. Keep them with you. I have to go to work. I was like, wait, you can't leave me with them out. Remember that I was terrified. She told me to not be pathetic and left for her work. I phoned my dad. He came to help me pack my stuff. I called the Blue Cross for urgent assistance and social services. I told them she was nuts, that these snakes she couldn't handle already killed a cat, and the baby was only 12 weeks old. Would have been a snack to the snakes. She was called to come home from work. I could tell by the look on her face she was furious, but she didn't say anything because my dad was there. I never heard from her and anything about them ever again. I still think about those boys. Many years ago, I did. This would have been around 1988 or so. I was asked to babysit on New Year's Eve for a mom who was going out with her boyfriend. She had 2 kids. One was 7 and the other was 4. I had never babysat for her before. She lived in a basement suite apartment, and the windows had no bars on them. Well, when I got there, she told me that, in order to keep the toddler in his crib, I had to use a vacuum cleaner cord and rewind it around the doorknob of the bedroom door, and then wind it around the door of the linen closet. My red flags were already going up all over the place. Then she told me that the 7-year-old was still in diapers. I was dreading that night, and I jacked up my price on her something serious. I believed I charged her $8 an hour, and if you recall the date, that was a fair chunk of change. After she left, the 7-year-old started making himself puke in order to get attention. I refused to clean it up, and I went and hid it underneath the couch. I was disgusted. The house was not that good either. It was pretty gross. I was only about 15 years old. Maybe 16. She was supposed to be home by midnight. By 2 AM, she still hadn't showed up, and I was about to call the police, as she wasn't answering at the number she gave me. I actually had the phone in my hand, and all of a sudden the window in the basement broke. Apparently, her brother had gotten drunk, or blitzed out of his mind on some substance, and was mad as hell at her for something or other. He tried to break in through the window but couldn't fit. I called 911 right away. Obviously, the kids are in bed by this time. He went headfirst trying to come through the basement window, and I clocked him on the head with something. I think it was a soup pot, if I remember right. So now he was mad at me and threatening to kill me. He pulled his head out pretty quick and turned around and started coming through feet first. So I started whacking him on his legs with the vacuum cleaner cord that is refused to use. Earlier the police arrived and he was arrested on the spot, of course. Mom arrives home shortly after. Maybe 15 minutes later, the police are still doing their statements. She was starting to yell at me for having her brother arrested. When the police figured out that she was supposed to have been there at midnight, and I also told them about her saying I had to tie the door shut, she changed her tune. They advised her to pay me with a very big bonus. She paid, plus $100. It was the biggest clusterfuck of a babysitting job I've ever had in my entire life, and I have babysat a ton. It was also the most money I was given a single night, because I doubled my price after midnight, and that $100 bill. I actually kind of suspect that the $100 bill came from one of the police officers, because there's no way that she would have had $100 bill floating around in 1988 on New Year's Eve, and she was plastered drunk. I was taken home in a police car, and I never did find out what happened to her or the kids. The only thing that I was told was that she was not allowed to look after the kids that night. That was a long time ago now. I've always wondered if those two kids survived their childhood okay. So I've got two tales for ya, one where I was the child and the other was when I worked at a summer camp. As a kid my dad taught me that if anybody broke in, that I should lay on top of the chairs under the dining room table so I could hide, because even though they could look under the table, the bottom of the chairs and the tablecloth would block me from sight. Now, since I was probably 4 or 5, I had to be the queen of hide and seek. So while my mother's coworker was babysitting me, I hid under there as a surprise hide and seek game. She obviously couldn't find me, and eventually called my mother, who didn't know, and ended up calling the police. The police couldn't find me in the house and set up a whole neighborhood search, and I wasn't answering because, well, I fell asleep lol. They finally called my dad. He was in the military and overseas at the time, so contacting him was difficult, and he just said check under the table on the chairs, and there I was. TLDR, I hid on top of the chairs while playing hide and seek. The babysitter called the police after not being able to find me because I fell asleep there too. During my first year at a summer camp, I was only an assistant to the head counselor. Our group was about 20 kids around the age of 7. This one girl, we'll call her Tessa, seemed a bit off from the beginning. She wouldn't play with other kids, would constantly bring toys from home, even though it was specifically ruled against, and speak differently than other children. Differently as in, she would use very big and dark words, ones you would learn from watching Game of Thrones or something. One day when we put her in timeout, she fell on the floor, completely silent at first, stared up at us, and screamed, "I will not go into solitude. I'll slit your throats and wrists first." Yeah, not things that normal 6-year-olds say. According to her parents, who seemed very nice and normal, said she was also very difficult at home, and would often have trouble actually catching her during playtime in order to send her home. Later on in the camp, maybe a week later, we were on the playground with our group, and Tessa and another little boy who was widely known to be very social and loving to his peers were playing a game together, and we thought it was sweet. As soon as they got out of direct sight, there was a wretched scream. We ran over to find Tessa pinning him down to the ground, while his left forearm was dripping with blood. He was screaming and crying so much that he was barely understandable, so another counselor pulled him inside to get him cleaned up. I and one other took Tessa aside and asked what happened. She had apparently carved her name into his arm with her fingernails so that they could be best friends forever. We called her parents to come and pick her up and recommended her to one of the school psychologists and stated that she was suspended for the rest of that year's camp. The next year I was managing my own group of 13-year-olds, hell, and a close friend of mine had the group that Tessa was in. That poor little boy was there too, still with his arm scarred with her name. Apparently Tessa was acting very well for the first 2 weeks of camp, always listening and never having outbursts. Until the very last day of camp, my friend had politely asked her to clean up some markers so they could move on to the next activity, then turned around to help another child when Tessa picked up a metal chair and threw it at the other counselor's head, knocking her out cold. Of course the room erupted into chaos, but Tessa jumped on top of my friend and continued to beat her with her fists until another child eventually got the door open and alerted other staff. My friend was rushed to the hospital with a concussion and in need of stitches. She didn't want to press charges. We called the parents and they refused to pick their daughter up. We ended up having to call the police to write a report as well as escort the child home. She was expelled from camp and the family moved out of town. TLDR. 7-year-old girl at summer camp I was working at carved her name into another camper's arm with her fingernails so they could be best friends forever. The next year the same girl threw a chair at a counselor and beat her until she was out cold. Child was taken into police custody because the parents refused to come pick her up. I worked in a child development center. I was head of the infant program. We took babies at 6 weeks and they stayed with us until they were walking and then moved up to the next room. I have a whole gripe about that situation, but that's another story. Anyway, we had very young infant who hadn't been with us long. One of our providers went to change the baby's diaper. She suddenly called me over. The baby had dark bruises all over her bottom and thighs. Some of the bruises looked like where someone had dug their nails in. Clearly someone had hurt the baby. I went to the director of the center and reported it. She called CPS. A social worker showed up. I had to take the baby and go with the social worker to the hospital to have the baby looked at by a nurse. I'll never forget how mean that nurse was to me. She was so cold, talked in an angry voice at me, and was just an all-around bitch. Come to find out, she thought I was the mother. As soon as she realized her mistake, she changed and was extremely nice. I hated her. Not knowing anything about the situation, it was a terrible way to treat someone. Even if I had been the mother, this nurse knew nothing of the situation. This was well over 20 years ago, and other than the nurse being cruel, I don't remember everything that happened at the hospital. I remember it took a long time. Then we went back to the center to wait for the mom to pick up her baby. The social worker was there with the police. The director wanted me to stay until it was all over. The mom was a teen, barely out of high school. She came to get her baby and realized what was happening and she became hysterical. She said they'd left the baby with her boyfriend's brother on Saturday. Sunday, while giving the baby a bath, she saw the marks but didn't know what to do. She was afraid to tell anyone, thinking she'd be blamed for leaving the baby with the uncle, who was known to have problems and not be reliable. This all took place that following Monday. The baby was taken by CPS. I just remember that young mom being so devastated. It turns out they let her mother take the baby while an investigation was done. The uncle eventually had charges brought and the mom did get her baby back. I heard all this through the grapevine. We never had the baby in our care again. It was exhausting, keeping it together the entire day. I'd called ahead to let my husband know I was going to be late getting home. I usually got off early afternoon. I was the one who opened at 6 AM and my assistants worked until dinner time. But I'd had to stay, waiting for the police and the mom to show up. When I finally drove up to the house, my husband met me in the driveway to give me a hug and I finally just lost it. I must have been 8 when I saw the cops enter the house and go straight to the backyard. Apparently they were looking for someone. There were helicopters with searchlights going around my neighborhood. Same thing happened to me when I was babysitting. The kids were in bed and I was waiting for the parents to come home. Normally they knocked before they came in to let me know it was them. I would usually be chilling on the sofa with my novel or manga listening to music. My Naruto Shippuden and Doobie Brothers was rudely interrupted one night when cops came to the door asking to search the backyard in the house. I simply said yes and led them to the back door, as the house was quite large. Some cops went upstairs to make sure no one got in. The parents came home to see about 6 cruisers and a SWAT van in their neighborhood and were not allowed into the house. I just sat in plain sight with my manga, sweating because I was scared I was somehow the problem, and they didn't exactly tell me the description of who they were looking for, or I simply forgot because I was scared. Got paid double that night. $60. I only called the cops on the actual home owners when I found what looked to be cocaine on the master bedroom nightstand. I went in there to look for a charger because my phone needed it. I did manage to find one, and I used it, but I called from the house phone. They got an narco dog in there to sniff it out. It was coke. The cops put their cruisers around the corner and told me to wait with them. They searched the parents as they walked in the door. They ended up finding a lot of coke in the mom's purse. They charged her with possession and intent to sell when they found several $100s in cash. Long story short, they went to jail, and I got to meet the grandparents. It was in kind of a seedy neighborhood too. Great kids, though. I called DCFS, CPS, on a family member. They had previously run a courier service for medical samples. Basically, if you have something biocide it has to be sent to the lab, and they were the ones to pick it up and drive it there. They eventually just stopped doing it out of sheer laziness. Didn't even inform the medical clinics, just didn't show up. This person had previously taken custody of me, and I became a live-in babysitter for the 2 babies. They could both walk and we into everything all the time. I missed a lot of school and spent every minute of every day raising 2 kids that weren't mine. I fed them every meal, bathed them, clothed them, shopped for groceries, and got them clothes from the local donation center when they grew out of things. Put them to bed every night, dealt with every fight, meltdown, accident and injury. But anyway, after the courier business fallout, they still had hundreds of sample jars full of formaldehyde. The car was repossessed, so they just left all the formaldehyde sitting on the front porch where the kids play. I was constantly directing them to other areas of the house, but they were so curious about it. They thought it was juice. Eventually family member brought home a new love interest who was severely narcoleptic and on a cornucopia of prescription drugs, which he left all over the house. Neither one of them had any interest in raising the kids, so it fell to me. After my 14th birthday I finally cracked and called the authorities. I felt I couldn't keep the kids safe, and I couldn't take the stress of mothering 2 kids while starting high school. I called anonymously, but it was just assumed that it was me. I was kicked out. CPS came in and finger wagged a bit and left. That was it. The boy ended up becoming severely obese and would cheat himself until he was 10. Trying to get him mother's attention, not sexually assaulted. The girl had her first child early enough that the baby was with her for her 8th grade graduation and walked with her for HS grad. The father of the baby was about the same age as the girl, both around 13 to 14. It's fucking sad. I was only related to them distantly by marriage, not anymore, but I still wanted to see those kids do well. Last time I reached out they started hinting that they needed money for X, Y, and Z things, but they had a brand new PS3 and games, obviously a while ago. Gotta love Appalachia. One summer my sisters and I watched these 3 kids, 2 boys who were like 5 and 6 and a little girl who was 3. The mom was a mess. Total alcoholic. The kids would come over at night. She was a stripper, so we watched them overnight, and she hadn't fed them all day because she was passed out. They would slap her and scream at her and nothing. One time when she dropped them off she laid down on the couch and passed out and pissed herself. One day we called the cops after she picked them up to report her driving drunk. She told us the cops pulled her over, but she got out of it, wink wink. So we called Child Protective Services. We kept calling them because they kept saying there was nothing they could do. We told them she was passed out drunk all day and not taking care of the kids at all, and that she was driving drunk with them. We still got nothing we can do. At the end of the summer she drove the kids home and went in and passed out, but she had left the 3-year-old little girl in the car. This was in August or September in Arizona, so over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time anyone realized it, the little girl was dead. It makes me sick to my stomach and so angry to think about it, and it has been 16 years. The dad finally got custody of the two boys, which he had been fighting for 4 years, but the last I heard the older one is in prison. It's just such a horrible avoidable tragedy. TLDR, we called the cops and child protective services on alcoholic, neglectful mom multiple times, but they did nothing, and a beautiful 3-year little girl ended up dead. Not that I babysit on purpose. So this one lady I lived with, B, had myself and another lady, K, that rented from her. We all three worked together. The said lady who also rented, K, had a 5-year-old child who she didn't have actual custody of. K's child came to spend the summer with her. Myself and renting lady, B, both worked full-time as well as K, but myself and B, neither one wanted to babysit this kid, and we told her that repeatedly. K had nowhere to put said child while she worked, so she asked me and B to do it. I said I wouldn't do it as I had a very busy life and I didn't wanna be in charge of said 5-year-old. And B said no, because she knew K wouldn't pay her and didn't wanna cause tension in the house, and B also lived a pretty busy lifestyle, coming and going all hours of the day for various reasons, since she had a teenage daughter who was also very busy. So K told us she would just get her aunt to do it. One day I'd woke up super late on my off day, probably around 11 AM, and I knew that K was at work and B was gone doing whatever. So I go downstairs to wash laundry. NBD. I put my laundry in the wash and left to go get food and a few items I needed. I come back around 2 and everyone was still gone, and I put my wash in the dryer. Realizing I left my dryer sheets in the car, I parked in the back driveway towards the bottom of the house near the section that K rented. When I got to my car I heard people talking, so I figured K had left the TV on. But then the basement room door to the outside opened, and there stood the little 5-year-old child. Startled, I asked him what he was doing, and when he got back home, turns out she left her 5-year-old child home by himself with no knowledge on any other adult's behalf. Not only had she done it that day, he said that she'd been doing it all freaking week. At one point K, B, and myself all were at work together for like 3 hours and the house was totally empty, with Lunchables in the mini fridge, and told him specifically to play his game and be real quiet so we wouldn't know he was home. I was absolutely furious. Not only did she leave him home by himself, there was a big dog, pool, and hot tub all right outside the basement door. Had he decided he wanted to go outside and swim or play with the dog for any reason, something bad could easily happened. Not to mention, if there had been a fire of any kind, the poor kid would have been left for dead, since nobody had any knowledge he was there in the first place. I still get heated when I think about it, so I called CPS on her, because 5-year-old children should never be left at home by themselves under any circumstances. Well, I felt like I was babysitting. In my early 20s I drove an ice cream truck for a summer. I was driving slowly near a school when a boy about 5 years old ran into the street after my truck. I pulled over to lead the kid out of the street because he crossed a busy intersection to get to me point. When I got out of my scooter, I saw the kid was dirty, barefoot, no shirt, pants on backwards and no underwear. I asked him where his parents were, and he said his mom is sleeping. I told him that he needed to go home because his parents would be scared if they didn't know where he was. It took forever to get him to go home because he kept trying to follow me when I tried to leave. I didn't feel comfortable leaving him at this point, so I decided to get him back to his parents. We crossed the street together to his house. A neighbor came out and saw the whole thing. When he opened the door I asked if his mom was home and if I could talk to her. It was strange because his tone changed and he seemed really fearful about disturbing his mother. We were there for a half hour and there was no adult to be seen. He said his dad wasn't around. The kid seemed really excited to have someone to talk to, and we were waiting for a long time. I tried knocking and getting the attention of adult in the house. Nothing. The neighbor and I called the police for an abandoned child. The police took their sweet time, 2 hours to show up. Typical PD in my town. The kid excitedly talked about a ton of things and was really happy to get free ice cream from me. He was really excited about my meter-made cart turned ice cream truck. I think he was happy to not be alone. The police finally arrive and assure me that they have the situation handled. They have had plenty of calls to House Hash 420 for quite some time. This boy will probably be put in the system. I feel guilty for changing the boy's life, but I really hope it's for the better. I didn't call the cops, but I realize now I should have. A little backstory. The mom lived just down the street in the same apartment complex as me and my dad. I was 13 at the time and I honestly can't remember what prompted me to start babysitting for her, but I did. She had 2 kids, a 7-year-old with ADHD and a 1-year-old, that I honestly can't remember ever even crying. One of the most prominent stories in my mind babysitting for this woman was, after she had moved, I helped her move. She had me there for the day, and said she was going out for 10 minutes, to go get some groceries. 5 hours later, her son has been crying in my lap asking, when mommy is coming home, and I finally got him calmed down, and in bed, when she comes in. Clearly drunk off her ass, and I get upset with her, obviously, and ask where she was for so long. She told me it was none of my business and I need to find my own ride home now, because she can't drive. Keep in mind she paid me by the day not the hour and I think I was only getting $20-30 a day. This is the same woman who actively encouraged me to get with an at the time 18-year-old man, and told us we'd make a cute couple. Another story is, when she wanted me to take her kids out for Halloween, she didn't go with us, and gave me no instructions as to how to get around her new neighborhood, and didn't write down her address for us in case we got turned around. I've got terrible memory, and seeing as she always picked me up I never had a reason to remember her address by heart. When we finally did get back she took all of their candy and mine and hid it in her room. Looking back on these stories, and realizing that I never once held Hannah, or heard her cry, whine, laugh, snore, anything, I'm highly concerned about whether that baby was okay. I should have called the cops, but I was a dumb child that didn't realize how bad the situation actually was. Didn't call the police, but crazy anyways. Long story short, I've been babysitting for 10+ years, and have seen many things. One of most crazy one was, I regularly babysit for a single dad with 2 boys. 3 months later he mentioned he's going away to Europe for a conference, where he is going to do a speech, and ask me to nanny his kids for 5 days while he's away. I agree. A day before the trip, the mom, which I never heard of, shows up with a judge paper saying that, if he's going out of the country she should have the guardianship of the kids. Dad freaks out, because he's been solo with full guardianship for a few years and contest the order. I had to talk to her lawyer and some people to prove he hired me, and the mom said the dad was going to kidnap the kids. Judge ruled over to him, and told him to give the kids passport for his lawyer. Crazy 5 days as well. Dad told me they had moved to a city 1 hour from me, and the kids were still in the school in my city, plus I was working. Had to replan my schedule and drive 3+ hour a day between pick up and drop off. Dad came back and told him wouldn't do anything like that anymore. Fast forward 5 months, I receive a random call from his phone number. I pick up, and it's a nurse from a local hospital telling me the dad is in critical condition and needed to go to surgery urgently, and that he told her I was the only person he trusted his kids with, and if I couldn't pick them up, they would call CPS to get the kids. Me being too nice, plus the kids were really nice and polite, I drop everything and go pick up the kids at the hospital, bring to my friend's place as I didn't have enough space at my house, stay with the kids for the weekend without knowing if the dad would be okay. Fast forward Sunday, dad calls. He's alive and okay, needs to stay 4 more days at the hospital. Ask if I can keep the kids till I accept and make plans for the week. Last minute on Sunday kids tell me they moved schools and they are now 2+ hours away from our city. Also it's winter, and I'm not allowed to drive to their city without winter tire, which I didn't had at the time, and was not willing to spend the extra money on it. Try to make another plan, and luckily a friend who helped the previous time was off that week and could keep the kids during the day while I was at work. Had to keep kids out of school. Tuesday I receive a text from the mom begging if I knew where the kids were because the dad hasn't answered her text or calls and kids missed their therapist apt. I explained to her what happened. She's glad I had the kids, but mad, and if I didn't reply to her she was about to report the kids missing. It went through my mind the SWAT coming through the window and arresting me for kidnapping. She tells me in this case I had to give the kids to her. I tell her I'm more than happy to drop them off with her at the ferry stop. Mom lives on an island nearby only accessible by ferry, but I can't promise, since I knew their parental case was pending. She says she will talk to her lawyer and call me back. I receive later on a call from the MOC asking what happened, and later on thank me for doing that and getting the kids cause it was better for them going with someone they knew and trusted, and because their judicial case was sensitive she was going to ask the mom to let me have the kids, as this moment was not the right time to move the kids around. Thursday dad gets released from hospital and I return the kids 5 months later. The dad's mom, or grandma of the kids, calls me because the dad was arrested because he abused of a woman he was going out with. Kids get picked by CPS. Grandma pleaded for help the dad. I told her not this time. I was happy to help the kids twice, but this is too much to ask from me. Later on I learned dad got out less than a month. Kids were moved to a foster family on the mom island and was getting supervised visits, and now the mom has full custody of the kids. They had serious reports on mom, but was believed the dad had planted on the kids' mind. I know they are happy now with their mom, but I miss those kids. Hope to see them again one day. I'm the parent and we called the police on one of our children. Our kids had one of those flip video recorders, and I was looking through the videos on it and came across one that didn't show a sex act, but it captured a verbal, non-touching, nudity involving interaction between two of my kids that indicated they'd been doing some things. We started asking questions and demanding answers, and our oldest, 5 years older than youngest, fessed up, and we uncovered some very early kinds of abuse by the oldest of all 3 of our other kids. We thought we had to get the police and social services involved so that we could get proper counseling and therapy. The defense attorney we hired later told us that he would have advised us differently if we'd come to him first, but I don't regret the path we took. Our oldest was eventually arrested and charged, but we already had offenders separated from victims, living with grandparents, and everyone in counseling and therapy before the court-ordered stuff was handed down. In our state for minors there is a program that allows therapy in lieu of conviction. The police involvement for us was comical and did more damage than good. I think our local police force has learned some things about how to handle these cases better in the future. It helped us when it came to court defense. I don't regret this path because everyone who ever might have wanted to investigate this, if someone new learned about it later, had already been involved. Police, social services, local prosecutor's office, judge, probation, juvenile justice, etc. We are 5 years past it now and have been allowed to reunite everyone with the approval and oversight of the therapists of both the victims and offender. By the way, the offender's therapist says child-on-child sex abuse is more common than is talked about and highly underreported. This happened back in 80s before daycare was a thing that was regulated. My mum fell into before school care for a few kids because we lived a 2-minute walk to my school, and parents that needed to go to work early would drop their kids off at our house. My mum had a limit of 6 kids as she did it more out of the goodness of her heart than it was a business, and she would often not worry about payment when parents told her they couldn't afford to pay. Once we were down to 5 kids and word got out my mum would look after one more kid. The mother of the child my mother agreed to mind was told just the one child. Morning comes and she turns up at our door with 3 other kids that are not hers and don't even go to our school, and says to my mother, "Oh, you can just drive them to their school, it's just the next suburb over." For a start, my mother couldn't drive a car and told her so, and they got into a heated argument at the front of our house. My mother told her to get lost basically, and then this woman wouldn't leave because she didn't want to have to look after them until school time. My father was getting ready for work and heard the commotion and went out and told her in no uncertain terms to get lost. He said, "You were told one child, not 4, and all these kids walk to the same school. We don't provide a bus service to any school you want. Leave and take those kids with you, or I will call the police," he said to her. She begrudgingly left with the kids, so police were not needed, thankfully. My mother later found out through the mum grapevine this woman had been telling her friends she knows a place that will look after your kids before school. Then when her friends hit her up to take their kids, she just tried dumping them on my mother.